Welcome to my personal archive. I am the Keeper. This isn't just a crime channel, it's a record of our fascinating inability to be normal. Here, we open doors that should have been locked forever and analyze the fingerprints that darkness leaves behind. If you seek comfort or easy answers, this isn't the place for you. But if you have the stomach for the naked truth, pull up a chair. I have the keys. There is a chasm between what we believe to be order and the inherent fragility of human existence. A chasm where shadows stretch and the darkness dwelling in some individuals reveals its most perverse face. Today, we dive into two cases that challenge our understanding of evil and vulnerability, exposing the terrifying reality of when safety unravels and life becomes a stage for incomprehensible acts. The peaceful town of Elmwood had always been synonymous with safety, a haven of tree-lined streets and neighbors who knew each other by name. But that peace was shattered in 2017 with the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, a 21-year-old college student. Sarah was the epitome of youth and promise, bright, full of life, with a promising future ahead. She vanished without a trace after a party at a friend's house, her backpack and phone left untouched in her apartment. At first, police treated the case as a runaway, a youthful whim. But her parents knew something was deeply wrong. The absence of any contact, the inexplicable gap in her once active social life, screamed for a darker explanation. 6 months later, Michael O'Connell, a retired history teacher and well-respected community member, disappeared just as mysteriously. Michael, a man of impeccable routines and methodical habits, went for his morning walk and never returned. His house was untouched, door locked, breakfast untouched on the kitchen table, a half-read book beside his favorite chair. Two vastly different lives, seemingly unconnected, yet both vanished with an almost surgical absence of evidence. The connection, however, emerged through a chilling detail that slowly surfaced from conversations with neighbors and reluctant witnesses. In both cases, residents reported seeing a shadowy figure or an elusive presence watching the houses days before the disappearances. A silhouette moving on the edges of vision, almost imperceptible, dissipating before it could be confronted or identified. The media, hungry for explanations amid the growing terror, quickly dubbed the perpetrator the Elmwood Shadow. The town was consumed by a chilling paranoia, a fear with no face. The investigation dragged through a mire of dead ends. Elmwood's police force, accustomed to petty crimes and the predictable routine of a small town, was unprepared for the sophistication and silent cruelty behind these events. The lack of bodies was the most disturbing and disorienting aspect. No ransom notes, no signs of struggle that could be detected, only the void left by the vanished lives. Parents forbade their children from playing outside, doors once open and inviting were locked tight, and suspicion became the norm in every social interaction. The fear was not just of a visible abductor, but of a ghost, a presence seemingly operating outside the laws of logic and physics. Criminal psychologists brought onto the case speculated about the motivation behind such audacity. Was this a predator who took pleasure not just in violence but in the psychological terror inflicted on the community, a collector of lives and others' anguish? Or an individual with deep trauma, projecting their own pain in a distorted way through acts of extreme violence? The absence of any demands, the lack of a clear pattern in victim profiles. Sarah, young and full of future, Michael, elderly and solitary, made building a precise psychological profile nearly impossible. The only link was the impeccable and traceless way in which they disappeared, and the persistent sense of a watching presence before each act. The Elmwood shadow not only took lives, it obliterated them from existence in a clean, terrifying manner, leaving behind only haunted memories and the relentless question, where are they? And, more disturbingly, who will be the next to vanish into the void? This pattern of extreme violence, the ability to erase people without a trace, suggests meticulous planning and a cold mind. The perpetrator, whoever they are, possessed a deep understanding of local surveillance, victim routines, and the psychology of fear, using anonymity as their most potent and destructive weapon. Each day without answers only deepened the wound in Elmwood, transforming a once idyllic town into a monument to unresolved terror. The shadow still lurks, and the truth about Sarah Jenkins and Michael O'Connell remains hidden, trapped somewhere in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered. But where the Elmwood shadow confronts us with the horror of absence, the next case leads us to a setting where the presence of death is undeniable, and appearances can be more deceptive than any shadow. We descend into the isolated depths of Whispering Pines, where a family met their fatal end, and the official narrative quickly unraveled under the weight of secrets and contradictions, revealing a far more complex and disturbing truth. The story of the Miller family in Whispering Pines is a grim reminder that isolation does not always offer refuge. On the contrary, it can sometimes only amplify human drama to its most tragic climax, where privacy may become an invitation for the unthinkable. On an autumn morning in 2012, an unusual and nearly supernatural stillness hung over the remote Miller family estate, nestled among the dense pines that give Whispering Pines its name. Mark and Susan Miller, along with their two teenage children, 16-year-old Emily and 14-year-old David, were known for their seclusion, seeking a life far from the chaos and constant surveillance of modernity. When neighbors, concerned about the prolonged absence of movement and a buildup of newspapers in the mailbox, called authorities, what was discovered inside the home stunned even the most experienced and hardened officers. The scene was one of unspeakable horror, a nightmare painted in dark tones of blood and despair. Mark Miller was found in his armchair in the living room, a firearm beside him, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Susan and the children were in their respective bedrooms, with wounds consistent with the use of the same weapon. Investigators' initial conclusion was swift and disturbing. A classic case of murder-suicide. Mark, the family patriarch, was believed to have taken his family's lives before turning the weapon on himself, a desperate act of violence. Local and national media echoed the narrative, painting a picture of a man overwhelmed by unknown pressures, driven to an unimaginable collapse. However, as forensic detectives dug deeper into the crime scene, cracks began to emerge in the official story. Like fissures in a flawless facade, the angle of the weapon and the trajectory of the bullets in Mark Miller's body raised the first doubts. Was it physically possible for him to have inflicted those wounds from that position and with such precision? In addition, all doors and windows were locked from the inside, initially reinforcing the suicide theory. But the absence of gunshot residue on Mark's hands, a crucial and nearly unforgivable inconsistency, began weaving a web of uncertainty investigators could no longer ignore. The Miller family's psychological profiles didn't align with the narrative of a murderous father. Mark was indeed reserved and introspective, but there was no history of domestic violence, severe mental instability, or known explosive conflicts. Susan was described as a loving, protective mother, devoted to her children's well-being. Emily and David, though turbulent in typical teenage ways, showed no signs of serious familial conflict or issues that might precipitate such tragedy. The small local community, though regarding the Millers as somewhat eccentric in their choice of isolation, described them as peaceful and harmless. The investigation took a darker turn when a private diary belonging to Susan was discovered hidden in the attic under loose floorboards. Within its pages, she detailed a growing fear of a presence around the property, strange noises in the forest at night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. She mentioned an all-seeing eye and repeatedly wrote about the whispers in the woods, drawing closer each night, turning their seclusion into a prison. There was latent paranoia, but was it unfounded, the product of an isolated woman's mind, or a chilling premonition of a real and imminent threat? The absence of obvious signs of forced entry remained the biggest hurdle for the external intruder theory. Yet, a meticulous forensic analysis uncovered tiny leverage marks on the back door's lock, almost invisible to the naked eye, that could indicate specialized tools were used to gain entry, suggesting the intervention of someone with expertise in breaking and entering. Even more shocking, traces of unknown DNA were recovered from beneath Susan Miller's fingernails, suggesting a desperate struggle, a violent confrontation, not a passive and resigned death. This discovery radically transformed the case. It was not a self-inflicted act of familial tragedy, but instead a brutal and well-planned homicide, ingeniously disguised to appear as something else entirely. The crucial question remained, and still echoes: who and how did the perpetrator manage to enter and leave unseen, orchestrating such a deceptive and complex scene? The Millers' tragedy in Whispering Pines evolved from what seemed a bleak case of domestic violence into a cold, calculated, and brutal mystery, where the isolated forest held its own secrets. The Miller family didn't take their own lives. Their lives were stolen by an external force, by an intelligent and cruel perpetrator, and the truth still lingers, silent and haunting, among the very pines that gave the place its name, awaiting justice. From the silent terror of the Elmwood shadow to the deceptive tragedy of Whispering Pines, each story reminds us of the persistent darkness that can reside in the human heart, or lurking just beyond in the nearest shadows. These are not merely crimes, they are deep scars in society's fabric, profound questions about the nature of safety, vulnerability, and justice that too often eludes our grasp. On The Keeper, we continue to tirelessly search for the truth, to shine light into the darkest shadows, and ensure that these stories, and the victims who lived them, are never forgotten. Until next time, remain vigilant, for the shadows are many and deep, and justice sometimes is a long and winding road.